so much, Heidi. Appreciate that. You grab your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Psalms. Book of Psalms, I'll give you the chapter in just a few moments here, but if you'll go ahead and find Psalms, I hope you have a prayer bulletin on the back. We have the outline. We'd love for you to follow along, and we might have some extras back there if we can get an usher who can hand out some of the outlines. For the next few weeks, we're just going to do some different ones, lessons and studies. We're not going to get into a book study yet. We'll do that in a few weeks, and we're preparing and planning, praying about that, and so we'll do that here. But we're going to just hit some general things here the next few weeks, and then we have our missions conference and things there. So if you need an outline, if you'd catch Brother Cliff's attention as he makes his way back to the back of the auditorium, you get his attention, grab one of those. You'll see the title of the study this evening, or Bible study. It's simply a lesson on living in the aftermath of bad situations. You see, we've all had those moments when circumstances, situations have let us down, when people around us have let us down. It could be family or friends or others. And when the days darken, when the disappointment floods our heart, it may be due to your own bad decisions. We make mistakes, and sometimes that brings difficult situations, challenging situations. Maybe it's due to somebody else's actions or bad decisions. Maybe that of a loved one, maybe that of a friend, a family member, whatever the case may be. We've all been there, though. In the aftermath of a bad situation where sorrow reigns, where hearts are just very weighed down. Maybe your children or grandchildren have acted foolishly. Maybe a friend or a family member has made some bad decisions, and now they're facing the deserved consequences, and they may last weeks, months, years, even a lifetime. And there you are, you're just kind of caught along for the ride. See, we often talk and identify how some people, sin affects everyone. Decisions affect more than just yourself. So what do you do in such situations? How do you handle that? Where do you look? Is it enough to say, hey, look to God and look to His Word? As you and I have faced such situations in our lives, we can empathize with one of the saints of old. You see the first blank there in our title. We're going to put in the name of Moses. Moses. You see, what I find interesting about the life of Moses, specifically as we look in his leadership of the nation of Israel, do you realize that as he led the Jews through the wilderness in the first trip, can we describe it as such, when he did so, do you ever think about this? When he first approached the Promised Land, Moses likely was seemingly at the end of his assignment, at least in the deliverance from Egypt, the trek through the known wilderness at that point, and then on the doorstep of the Promised Land. There he was. He had been faithful to lead them from Egypt to that doorstep of the Promised Land, and then in Numbers chapter 13 and Numbers 14, they came to Kadesh Barnea. You remember it well. You can just imagine as likely they could look into the Promised Land for there. They'd sent the spies in. The spies came back, and they brought the report, and there is success for Moses. Here he is. He's a humble guy, meek guy, backward in some ways, and yet as they're standing there and they're looking, and success was in reach. And it all fell apart due to the unbelief of the Israelites. Could you imagine what that would have been like as Moses? You feel like you're done. I mean, it's almost a test. It's almost a time to punch the card, and we're out of here. We've done our job. God's going to be happy, and all of a sudden, the Israelites blow everything up. They refuse to follow Moses into the Promised Land. They refuse to trust in God, and then judgment falls on the nation of Israel. They would wander now for 40 more years in that taxing wilderness, and a generation or two would die away without entering the Promised Land. I just imagine in the days that followed as they gathered everything up and as they turned to head back into the hot desert sand. How do you think Moses was feeling? What do you think was going through Moses' mind? I think I'll resign, maybe. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't what he had in mind. He's now having to go, and this mission that was supposed to last days would now last decades, all because of their sin of unbelief, all because of the decisions of someone else. How are you going to be sustained through that? How is Moses going to handle 40 years now putting up the very people that have caused this problem, that have created this issue for him, that have extended it from days to decades, that have now created a situation, the aftermath of which they will have to face day after day after day for 40 years? How do you cope with that? Maybe tonight you're going through a similar situation. Maybe due to your own decisions or somebody else's decisions, a family member, a friend, whatever the case may be, you yourself are facing that kind of situation that seems everlasting, that doesn't seem like we're going to have to deal with this baggage, we're going to have to deal with the consequences of these decisions for years, maybe a lifetime, whatever that may be. I would describe it as this way. Moses was going through a valley, a tough valley with his faith. And through the Scriptures, you and I are blessed to catch a glimpse into the mind and heart of a man that was just sentenced to 40 years hard labor as the result of someone else's lack of faith. Decisions they made. And I find this even more interesting. This is Numbers chapter 13 and 14, Kadesh Barnea, where this occurred. Do you realize that the error, the sin of Moses did not occur in Numbers chapter 20 where he hit the rock? What if they had entered the promised land by faith the first time? Guess who would have been there? Moses. You see, for Moses, this was a difficult situation. He's living in the aftermath of what transpired. So how did he keep on keeping on? It's amazing to me that, yes, in spite of the time where he hit the rock, boy, Moses was there time and time again, and even defending Israel or asking God to pardon them would be a better terminology. There was no defense for their lack of faith and trust in God at times, but man, he went to bat for him so many times. Well, God has preserved those thoughts of Moses that he held dear for us in the oldest psalm that we have in the Scriptures. Look with me, if you will, to Psalm chapter 90. Psalm chapter 90, it's entitled simply there, A Prayer of Moses, the Man of God. Psalm chapter 90, we'll read just the first couple verses, if you will. Look there with me. Notice what he says. He says this, and just three main points tonight. You see it on your outline there, but this is what he wrote, or his prayer, I should say. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or even thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. Okay, from verse number 1, we derive this simple point. Remember that God's a constant refuge. A constant refuge. When he begins his prayer, as we see here, Moses did not start with Jehovah. He started with a title for Jehovah. You see it there, verse number 1. The first occurrence of the word Lord is actually Adonai. That is a term that is reverential and signifies the sovereignty of God. Literally, that he governs everything. It's an immediate acknowledgement that he is sovereign over all earth and all mankind, that everything is in his hand. So immediately, I love this prayer because Moses started out, God, I realize you're in control. You are sovereign. And this didn't catch you by surprise. You already knew what was in the heart of the Israelites. It may have caught me by surprise. I find it funny. The first thing I thought when Brother Mark started out his praise tonight at 3 a.m., I'll tell you, I don't know many praises that happen at 3 a.m. First thing I thought, maybe this is a prayer request instead, right? Because that's the typical the phone call we get, right? 3 a.m., oh, this is bad news, right? This is not good. And I that just popped into my mind immediately. That not many praises happened then, but praise the Lord did. But here's reality. You know, the fact is this. Nothing catches God by surprise. You might be caught by surprise. We may have gotten a phone call about somebody who has a dire health need. We may have gotten a notice of some great need or tragedy, whatever the case may be. And even today, Pastor Aaron alluded to Destiny, and she called me today too and let me know about that Walker family, a young man, a young pastor, and has a 1-year-old baby. A tragedy hits. Now, did that surprise God? Did that catch him off guard? No. God is sovereign. And boy, you see, look at Moses, and would not, and forgive me, but I just can't imagine. I try to sometimes superimpose myself on these biblical stories. Could you imagine what you would feel when you're standing there on the edge of the promised land and you have to turn around and walk away for 40 years because of somebody else's decisions? That was Moses. Now, we can blame him. Maybe he wasn't the right kind of leader, whatever, okay? But they made a choice. They chose. And he is now suffering the consequences. He's having to live through the aftermath in a bad situation. And here his prayer is this. He reminds himself what you and I need to be reminded through every difficult situation. Our God is sovereign. He's in control. He goes on, and then he secondly speaks of it, and that's reference to a dwelling place. He speaks to the security and safety offered by God. I didn't throw in the word offered there in your outline, but you can add it if you'd like to. But the security and safety offered by God. He's a faithful and consistent dwelling place. That's how he describes God as, that refuge throughout. And did you catch it? I think this is crucial for us to emphasize. We'll add a little bit more to it in a moment. But he says through every generation. Isn't it comforting to know and reassuring that the very same God that was a refuge to Moses and the Israelites is a refuge today for you and me? The very same Jehovah, Adonai, is our refuge just as he was for Moses. I find it even more interesting. Hebrew word for dwelling place is translated other places in our scripture as habitation, and I like this one. It's translated as den. Okay, you ever seen an animal that's threatened, an animal that's maybe being chased or something? Boy, if they can get back to their den, that's safety, that's protection from anything and everything. They can just reach home. If they can just get back to their habitation, if they can just get back to the dwelling place, that den, that is security. That is refuge. And I love it that Moses said, listen, God, come thick or thin, come difficult circumstances or good circumstances, you are my refuge. You are my dwelling place. You're the den to which I resort, especially in those difficult situations I face. Moses says, God, this is what you are. Moses, no doubt, was discouraged. Are you discouraged today? There's a situation going on in your life where you're discouraged. Moses was no doubt disappointed. Have you been disappointed recently by somebody who's made some decisions, maybe decisions you've made, but just disappointment now resides in your heart because, boy, mistakes have been made, and now you're suffering the consequences. Certainly Moses was there. He was no doubt, too, wondering if he was up to the task ahead of him. So many of us are tempted to quit, to throw in the proverbial towel when things get difficult. Maybe when someone else has taken us through a difficult time because of their decisions, the choices that they have made. And my goodness, I've been around long enough to know so many of us here have faced that. Others have made decisions. Others have acted in such a way that has dragged you through a difficult situation. And yet your God is still a refuge in the midst of any situation. You see, again, he emphasizes he's a faithful refuge to every generation, and he's still continually offering security and safety. And then in verse 2, he expands upon that last two terms and to every generation. And he makes this point in verse 2. Did you catch it? He is timeless. The timelessness of God, the eternality of God. He has no beginning and no end. As you can imagine, in Moses, as their travels through the wilderness, and maybe they just left Kadesh Barnea, and they're traveling back in the wilderness, and they're surrounded on sides, and probably the largest, the biggest, the most substantial thing that they see on the horizon are the mountains. And to their minds, certainly as even ours, boy, how long have those been around? Those must have been here forever, these mountains. And so he takes that and he uses that as an illustration to express, those mountains look like they've been here forever, but God was here before the mountains were formed. Before this earth was formed. Look around, Israel. God was here long before these things came to be, and these things came to pass. Jehovah was God before, Jehovah is still God, and Jehovah will still be God when these mountains are gone. He goes on and he describes that he is from everlasting to everlasting. He is the refuge greater than any other that will always be present for you and I. Moses clung to this. This is what got him through. This first reminder that God is my refuge. These Israelites may let me down. In fact, they may want to trade me in for a new model. They may want somebody else to lead them. You can just imagine this. And all through it, what is Moses saying? God is my refuge. He comes to the end of the 40 years, and as he has the opportunity, because God has told him, and I don't know about you, but there would be both pros and cons coming to you and saying, okay, you're going to die. And giving you time to prepare. We know God takes him up, he lets him look into the promised land, and then he takes him away probably so that his bones wouldn't be worshipped and things like that. And nonetheless, he knows. And so he's able to speak to Israel one last time. And Moses, after his many years, 120 years of learning who God is and learning who he was and learning what God can do with nothing, he stands before Israel. And the opportunity to leave them with some lasting words, because he'll never speak to them again. Part of that, this is what he says. Deuteronomy chapter 33. The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. See the picture there? See, hey, Moses, what got you through? God's always been my refuge. You mean even when you had to turn around from going to the promised land? Yeah, he was there. You mean even when you're going through the Red Sea and the Egyptians you thought were going to catch? Yeah, God's been my refuge. And I love this picture. You know it. We see it often. Somebody say, hey, don't worry, just jump, I'll catch you. Now listen, if somebody says that to me and they're like this, I don't trust them. What do? Hey, come on, I got you. We stick out our arms. You see the picture? Underneath are the everlasting arms. I love to see sometimes when things like that go wrong. There's such a thing as trust, that became big a couple decades ago, where you got teamwork and you would trust things, and somebody'd stand here and everybody behind there put their arms together and they'd have to fall backwards and you catch them. I love watching video of when that goes wrong. They do that, the person falls like, oh, and then that person hits the ground like, man, I'm never trusting you again. The picture here, though, is everlasting arms. Listen, you will never trust God too much where he will not be there. You can't ever trust him and reach the end of his trustworthiness. He will always be there. He can always be your refuge. In this situation, yes. In that situation, yes. But man, I've tried him so many times before. Would you just try and see that the Lord is good? Try him. His everlasting arms are always there, and I don't know. Maybe in heaven we'll catch a glimpse. We'll be privy to Moses' private prayer time, but I just wonder if there was a special spot in his tent where he just fell on his face time and time again, and he ran to his refuge. My friend, I don't know what you're going through right now. I don't know how disappointing it is. I don't know how discouraged in your heart you truly are. But this one thing I know, you have a refuge. You have a refuge. Would you remember your refuge tonight? Moses, it got him through. Years may have lasted 4 days, 4 weeks, 4 months, 4 years. For Moses, it was 40 years. In a sense, treading water, going in circles in the wilderness, because he had missed out because other people's mistakes. Do you remember Isaac Watts, his hymn? It's entitled, "O God, Our Help in Ages Past." It's recorded that he used Psalm 90 in what Moses remembers here in his prayer as the basis or inspiration for that. And I love what he adds to it. He says, oh God, our help in ages past. But you remember what else he says? He says, our hope for years to come. I love that. Oh yeah, God, you've been there. And that's what he says. You've been our dwelling place in generations past, but you will be our dwelling place in generations to come. Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Aren't you thankful you have such a God that is such a refuge? Look at verse number 3, if you will, with me quickly. Verse number 3 and following. He says this, Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, Return, ye children of men. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are asleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. In the morning it flourisheth and groweth up. In the evening it is cut down and withereth. For we are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. Thou hast set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins in the light of thy countenance. For all our days are passed away in thy wrath. We spend our years as a tale that is told. The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet it is their strength, labor, and sorrow. For it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knoweth the power of thine anger? Even according to thy fear, so is thy wrath. Verse 12, so teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Number one, remember that God is a constant refuge. Number two, remember these considerable reminders. So remember that God is a constant refuge. And then number two, Moses would say to you and I, how do you get through this, Moses? How do you face such dire circumstances, the aftermath? Remember these considerable reminders. See, right away in verses 3 through 6, we are confronted, reminded of the simple truth of what? Life is short. The brevity of life, and dust returns to dust. No man will live forever in this body upon this earth. As much as God is eternal, you and I are frail. The illustrations of this chapter, did you catch them all? We are dust. He goes on to say our lives, and I like this one. He says our lives are quickly over as a watch in the night. A watch in the Hebrew night was about 3 hours long. And he says, listen, as quick as that's over, such are our lives. He says it's like a flash flood after a downpour. Oh, it's quickly here, but it's also quickly gone. And then I like this one. I think this, boy, for some of us, this hits home. You ever wake up in the morning after going to sleep the night before, and you're like, I feel like I just went to bed. I feel like I just went to sleep. That's what he says our life is like. He says it's like sleep. They are as sleep. Verse number 5. It is literally, that is what our life is. The older I get, the shorter sleep seems. Amen? Doesn't last as long as we like. And I remember even back when I had my surgery, man, it's just like, they gave you the anesthetic to put you out, and man, I feel like I just closed my eyes and I opened back up and it's already done, surgery and everything else. Like, wow, that was quick. Could I sleep for a little longer? I mean, just sleep is so quick. And that's literally, we would say this, boy, I just closed my eyes and I'm opening them again. Do you realize life is like that? That's what life is like. How many times you and I have probably said or thought to ourselves, boy, I blinked and there goes a year. I blinked and the kids grew up. I blinked and my life was gone. That's what he says here. He's reminding us that life is short. He describes it as the grass that grows in the morning, it flourishes, but when the night comes, we are cut down and withereth. And don't miss it, this is all presented, and I think this is neat, presented with the backdrop of the considerable reminder that when 1,000 years is gone, it is just like yesterday to God. Think on that. What was yesterday? Tuesday. Most of us, could probably remember some of the things we did yesterday. A week from yesterday? But yesterday, we remember that. Do you realize what he just said? In the grand scheme of things, our frailty compared to the eternality of God, 1,000 years to him is like looking at yesterday. 1,000 years. I can't help but thinking, first thing that pops in my mind, wow, you realize America doesn't even have a third of that to our history? We're not even a third old. Then I think a little longer. Do you remember Sunday very well? Do you remember what happened on Sunday? Do you remember how your day went? Maybe I could get really hard. Do you remember the messages preached on Sunday? Do you remember who you talked to? Do you remember the things that transpired on Sunday? I mean, we were just talking 3 or 4 days ago. We're just talking about Sunday. Now listen to me very carefully. Do you realize, using this equation, this formula, that the time that Moses and Israel lived is to God like 3 or 4 days ago? It's pretty amazing. You and I think 1,000 years, 4,000 years ago. That's crazy. That's beyond our comprehension. And to God, it's just like you and I looking back on Sunday. I don't know about you, but that sure does make me feel very small. And my life is so infinitesimal. It's so frail. It's so short compared to the eternality of God. That's what Moses is stepping back, and he's looking at everything in perspective, and he's saying, wait a second, boy, God, I see it. This life, these 40 years are actually pretty short comparatively to how you see things and in your eyes. And I can't help but connect it to what we just saw. What is Moses' point? Man, aren't you glad that the God to whom 1,000 years is like yesterday is your refuge? He's your God. You're Adonai, you're Jehovah, you're Yahweh. This is him. In verses 7 and following, now Moses gets to the meat of it in a sense. This is where it hurts. Here's where the wound is still raw. Here's where he talks about Kadesh Barnea. This is a big deal because Moses speaks of them being consumed by his anger, enduring the very wrath of God. And certainly he is personally experiencing this. He is speaking from a hurt heart. He is speaking from frustration and disappointment and discouragement because of the decisions that the Israelites made. And he realizes, boy, sin is painful. Sin hurts. We would put it this way. Here's the next reminder. Sin takes a toll on the human life. Sin takes a toll on human life. You see, in Numbers chapter 14, Israel's great failure is recorded there in chapter 13, 14. And look what God said to Moses. You remember this? This is quite a reminder. And the Lord said unto Moses, "And how long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me? For all the signs which I have showed among them, I will smite them with a pestilence." Literally killing them, disinherit them, and I will make of thee a greater nation and a mightier than they. And I'll tell you, man, if I put myself in Moses' shoes, I'd say to God, let me think about it a moment. Let me just think about it, because you know what? I'm kind of upset with them right now. Because they just stole the promised land from me. It's not happening, and you know what? It may be good to trade them in. That's not Moses. You know what Moses does? You probably remember. He goes to God and he seeks pardon for Israel. He goes and begs on their behalf. He asks God to show mercy to them. He pleads with God. And so in response, God sentences them to the wilderness for the next 40 years. Some have called it the world's longest funeral march. And so it was. Let us not forget that it is also a vivid illustration that what? The wages of sin is death. My friend, that is literally what that is a great picture of. Can I ask you, what keeps you from heaven? Well, he that believeth not is what? Condemned already. What transpired among the Israelites when they walked away from the promised land, when they refused to enter God's promised land through faith? They were sentenced to death. The world's longest funeral march. See, the verses here describe what the Israelites faced over the 40 years. Years, and I like the description here, years that were spent as a tale that is told. Tonight, you and I are revisiting this tale. You and I are reviewing and being reminded and challenged by it. I'm not sure of this, but look at verse 10. I think maybe that old hymn, "I'll Fly Away," is inspired by verse 10. He describes the length of life and what God was going to give some of them there in the wilderness, and certainly we derive much from that verse, but the end of it, I like the statement, speaking of human life, "It is soon cut off, and we fly away." I like that old hymn, "I'll fly away, O glory." For you and I, that's a great promise, isn't it? In context, Moses is describing that life is so short. Oh, the Israelites were going to suffer the wrath of an angry God. There's no doubt of that. We see this in this passage, the just punishment for not trusting in their powerful God who had displayed and demonstrated his great ability and power so many times before. So verse 11, we come to another reminder that Moses would have us to remember. It is good to fear the wrath of God. It's good to fear. Who knoweth the power of thine anger? Even according to thy fear, so is thy wrath. You see, whether you're a sinner headed for hell or a saint that has gone astray and faces the chastening hand of the Lord, the power of his anger and wrath is great. It is good to fear the wrath of God. It is good to fear the punishment, the chastening of God. And all of this is a backdrop as we build up to verse number 12, which is probably the greatest reminder that Moses gives us, and it's simply this: number your days and make your life count. Number your days and make your life count. Going through a difficult situation, I think Moses gives us a great illustration of somebody who said, you know what? This is not fun. This is not what I would have chosen, but I am in this boat because of other people's decisions, and I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to number my days, and I'm going to make it count for God. So he stuck to the task. He kept on keeping on, certainly for the glory of God. You see, if we fully grasp the power of God's wrath and anger, would any of us waste our lives as often as we do with foolish endeavors? If we truly had a healthy fear for the wrath and anger of God, would we waste this life, these precious few moments that are nothing in the sight of God, over foolish endeavors? Would we really have earthly gods that consume us and eat up our time and our energy and our investments? Would we really do that if we truly embraced with fear the wrath and anger of God? Fear him. Honor his wishes as Adonai, Jehovah. Bring him glory with the brief existence that we have here on this earth. Live in light of these reminders every day, is what Moses says. Remember these considerable reminders. Remember that God is a constant refuge. And now look at verses 13 through 17. Return, O Lord, how long? Let it repent thee concerning thy servants, a changing of mind and treatment. O satisfy us early with thy mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years when we have seen evil. Let thy work appear unto thy servants, and thy glory unto their children. Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish thou the work of our hands upon us. Yea, the work of our hands, establish thou it. Number 3, repeat these crowning requests. See, really, Moses, you see here, is really saying, okay, here are the crowning truths. Here are the things that these requests, the supplication of God, that need to be the crown of your life. He's looking ahead in these verses. Past experiences often prepare us for the present. Present experiences prepare us for the future. And all of life is preparing us for eternity. This is but a short rehearsal for eternity that we'll spend in the presence of God. In the midst of the hardest situation, God, our refuge, is still there, present. And he does want to bless us in all his mercy. Look at verse 14. It emphasizes this point, and certainly that is what Moses appealed to. Notice all the things that he requests. First of all, quickly, he prayed for God's favor. In verse 13, God, change your mind. I know they deserve it, and would you return us to that place of favor? He's beseeching God. Yes, they've been rightfully judged, and yes, they're being punished as they should be. But God, would you forgive them? Would you restore them to a place of favor and blessing? And I would ask this question: does God answer his prayer? And immediately I would say he sure does. In those 40 years, would you just think about the protection they enjoyed from their enemies throughout their wilderness? How God fought their battles and protected them for those 40 years? Do you realize in 40 years, not one day failed where they would find manna on the day that it should be found? 40 years. And probably the thing that I find most amazing, do you realize that in 40 years, their clothing never wore out? See, some of you and I, we're frugal. We'll wear something for 5, 7, 10 years. We'll wear it even when it goes out of fashion and comes back in. See, we'll get as much out of. Can I tell you, I don't think there's one of us that have gotten 40 years out of something. Wearing it every day. Now, let me ask you this. Did God judge Israel? He sure did. we have a human saying, every dark cloud has a silver lining. Let me put it this way. When God judges, God is still a God of mercy. And boy, in response to Moses' prayer, God shows them great favor. There were times that God literally brought water out of a rock. There were other times when God provided meat in due season. Provided for them. Did they deserve that? No way. They didn't trust in God. They wouldn't follow him into the promised land. But our God is so merciful. So often we can get in the bad aftermath of a bad situation and we forget how good our God is. Even in spite of the fact that we deserve worse. Was the situation bad? Yes. Was it deserved? Yes. Was God still in the middle of it, blessing them in spite of it? Yes. He is truly a merciful God. So I would ask you this. In the midst of your situation, is your focus on the bad situation or the blessings of God in the midst of that bad situation? You face your situation, and boy, it's all about the negative. It's all about, even though it's deserved and somebody's made bad decisions to get you there, is your focus on the negative, the bad, or are you looking for God in a bad situation? You've all probably seen it, and there's many knockoffs like it. You remember the books that came out, Where's Waldo? And you had to find that little guy with a little hat on every page and everything else. And boy, some of them were very hard. Listen to me, okay? Very carefully. God is not Where's Waldo. You don't have to look hard in any situation to find God. The question is, are you looking? Because if you're looking, you'll find him. Because God is in the midst of every situation. Pastor Henry, even the bad ones? Oh, yeah. Why? Because our God is a merciful, faithful God who is a refuge. Moses found it to be true. Moses is the one telling you and I, oh, he'll be there. He'll be there. Quickly, letter B. You know what else his request? He did this. He prayed for God to give them joy. Man, what a statement. He goes on and he says, Lord, satisfy us early with thy mercy, that we may rejoice, have joy, be glad all of our days. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted. He's praying for joy. Future looked bleak. The regrets would flow every day. Could you imagine, and this is what I think of, and we're running out of time, but could you imagine what those 40 years were like? So when did the generations start dying? Have you ever thought how many burials and deaths they must have had during those 40 years? Remember, a low estimate, 1 million people came out. I've seen estimates of 3 million came out of Egypt. Now, 3 million people over 40 years, and you have to get rid of a whole generation. Literally, you probably have to get rid of 2 generations because you already have some older folks that may be near death, and then you have a whole generation that above 20 years old that you have to get over. Listen to me. That is a whole bunch of death in 40 years. It's a whole lot of burials. And yet here's Moses, and he says, God, would you help us to maintain joy? Would you give us joy in the midst of a difficult situation? Would you make us glad, even though we're going through this whole thing? Man, how in the world would you have joy and gladness in the midst of the fallout and aftermath of such a great sin? Here's how you do it. Joy can only be found in the Lord and given from his good hand. He prays for it. It wasn't going to be an easy path. Sin had made sure of that, but God was still God, and Moses knew and expressed that in verse 14. And he said this, once God is your satisfaction, we can have joy and gladness even while punishment is falling. Seems like an oxymoron, but the reality is this, even while they would see evil, he mentions that in verse 15, they could experience joy. We say it every day, and boy, the world we live in and the consequences of the decisions of the people around us, you and I have to go through it. You and I have to face some of the fallout of that, the aftermath of a bad situation, in the midst of a bad situation. And yet the fact is, though we see evil, we can experience joy. And yet, he says this, satisfy us early. It only happens when God is your satisfaction. You realize, how did Joshua and Caleb and Moses come out of 40 years with that group of people and still ready to, for Joshua and Caleb for sure, ready to serve the Lord? Moses was still praising God, even though he was deprived of the promised land twice. he's still praising God, and he's still saying, God is my refuge. And I messed up. God punished me for it, but God was merciful. He took him up into the mountain, let him see into the promised land, and he praised God for it. How in the world they keep that spirit and that attitude through such a difficult time? Joshua and Caleb were gung-ho ready for the promised land. Why? Because God was their satisfaction. He was their joy, the source of their gladness. Real quick, letter C, Moses goes on to pray for God's glory to come shining through. Let thy work appear unto thy servants, thy glory unto their children. He asked for God's hand at work to be obvious and apparent to the people, those who were true to him, his servants. And I love that thought. He says literally, help us to see you're still at work. Even through this difficult situation, this punishment, you're still at work. Your work is going forward, even in the midst of the aftermath of this bad situation. Let us see your will being fulfilled in spite of it. Man, I love that prayer. You know, there's sometimes I find myself praying, Lord, would you just show me how you're working in this? Sometimes he answers, sometimes he doesn't. We trust him either way. Lord, where's your work? What are you doing? What's your hand doing in this situation? And then he says, the generations that come, that walk in our footsteps, may they see your glory in all of that. And I am reminded that in any situation, God can get the glory. Are you praying that way? Your situation. Your bad situation. Are you praying, God, give yourself glory. Bring yourself glory. And then quickly, last but not least, oh, there was those blanks, sorry. Last but not least, letter D. Finally, Moses prays for God's blessing on the work of his hands. Verse number 17. Simply put, he's asking God. You say, what is he praying in verse 17? Simply put, it is asking God that our lives would not be wasted. That God would guide us and bless us so that what we do will last for eternity. And I like that statement, beginning statement, man, verse 17, that it would put on display the beauty of the Lord. I love that. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us. Man, we display it even though we are unworthy. You say, what's the beauty of God? I think it's very much that God takes us and uses us in spite of. That God is merciful to us and he brings good things from bad situations, that he is merciful to us, so great of sinners. He can bring great things from bad situations. And man, I just think there is no better person to write about God displaying his beauty in our work. Who was Moses? Well, he was a slave baby that was destined to be murdered until God intervened, and he didn't just cause Moses to exist and survive. He literally brought him into the palace of Egypt. And then this baby, this adopted slave baby, then became great in Egypt, then great as the leader who would bring Israel from redemption of Israel and deliver them. And I love this reminder. You remember his mother, Jochebed? Remember what her name meant? God, my glory. Can I tell you, the story of Moses displays the beauty of the Lord. That he could do all that. That this baby that was destined to be killed and murdered, saved in a little boat made of bulrushes, and the Pharaoh's daughter, and this long line. And, oh my goodness, this entire story. Man, I'll tell you, you can't dream that up. That's just the beauty of the Lord. How he ties it together and he orchestrates things so perfectly. And you know what it does for us? You think your situation is bad? What if they were trying to kill your baby and every other baby in Israel? And yet Jochebed trusted in God, her and her husband. Man, you think about that. Can I tell you right now, your situation can display the beauty of the Lord. God's blessing upon your hand at work, and that you continue to trust in him. Man, isn't the ways and the working of God beautiful? He chooses you, frail mankind, to do it. That's beautiful. Yet it must be done by his strength and power. I leave you with this, and I'm sorry for keeping you a little longer, but here's the takeaways. 3 other ways of maybe outlining this passage would be this. Number 1, you know what he says first? Teach us. Teach us. Teach us to number our days. Teach us. Life is difficult, but we need to make the most of it for God's glory. Sin is seen to it that life is difficult. The devil sees to it that life is difficult. The bad decisions of ourselves and others are going to make life difficult. We come face to face. We embrace that reality, but we can still bring God glory. So teach us to number our days. Teach us to number them, that we may apply our hearts to wisdom so we can bring you glory. Number 2, he said, satisfy us. Life offers so little, but God offers us joy and gladness and peace in any situation. Lord, help me to find my satisfaction in you in this situation. As bleak as it looks, as difficult as it is, may I be satisfied in you. And then last but not least, that last verse, 17, he literally says, establish us. The work of our hand. May I just remind you, life is wasted if our work does not point to the beauty of God. And it will only do so through his blessing and work. Man, I sure am thankful for this prayer of Moses, aren't you? Saint of the Lord, one who trusted him through dire situation, is very encouraging and challenging to us. I hope you and I will take it to heart. We'll apply it to whatever situation we find ourselves in, and may God get the glory. Let's remember these prayer requests.